Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. As the major conflicts of the late 20th century grew ever more savage, they left in their wake a striking proliferation of tragedy, genocide, famine, pestilence, and disease. Most of these wars were internal, unconstrained by the boundaries of traditional warfare, and particularly destructive for the most vulnerable populations, women, the elderly, and children. The effects are long-lasting. Indeed, what's common to all this devastation is its ability to generate crises in public health and national reconstruction that linger over decades and range across borders. These events are aptly described as complex emergencies, and dealing with them is already a major international humanitarian challenge of the 21st century. My guest is Frederick Burkle, Jr., a Woodrow Wilson International Scholar for 2008. Dr. Burkle is uniquely qualified in the field of humanitarian responses to complex emergencies. His awards are many, and he's a widely published author who's currently also a clinical professor of surgery at the University of Hawaii, among many other high-level academic, governmental, and diplomatic postings. A retired naval officer, he's also a much-decorated combat veteran. Skip, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
Skip, with all those credentials, and there are many, many more I didn't mention, you're an ideal man to talk about this subject, which is absolutely essential. And I guess we should start with a definition, Skip. How would you define, with all your experience, what a complex emergency is?
Complex emergencies have applied to modern-day disasters, mostly conflict-based, that involve social, economic, political, health, and other aspects all coming together. And in the last third of the 20th century, where internal conflicts became very popular,
right,
especially after the Cold War, it was the term that was used to describe really the decline and often the demise of those internal conflicts in countries that were, during the Cold War, were either at on one side the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, or the West.
That's right, Skip. As I read some of your articles on this, I was struck by how the Cold War was kind of a disciplining mechanism that kept these things from happening.
Exactly.
And when that discipline broke down, roughly the last decade of the last century, we got, I think, in excess of 38, 39 of these events, and then they're coming into our century. As someone who's having a very distinguished career in public health, Skip, how significant a phenomena is this for the public health field? Has it become a major part of what you're concerned with, a growing part? How would you characterize it?
Excellent question, George, because initially we did not appreciate it. As a matter of fact, governmental bodies, international bodies, and even the non-governmental organizations really thought that these were going to be short-term events that would right themselves rather quickly. And the responses were really just emergency responses, management. And, but unfortunately, they became prolonged, more dangerous, more conflict-ridden over a period of time. And we had to sort of learn as we went along. But the characteristics of these complex emergencies were two. One, the direct effects from the internal warfare itself.
Right.
But then it took us, quite honestly, almost a decade to recognize the criticality of the indirect effects.
Such as, Skip?
Which were the result of the fact that the public health infrastructure and the systems, which are so protective to any civilized nation, had just collapsed. So water and sanitation and health and food and shelter and often, quite honestly, fuel, especially for those countries that were, had long and prolonged winters. So what we began to see is the emergence of what we call indirect public health and preventive problems that were related to the loss of protection now, or the destruction of the public health protections.
That's an excellent point, Skip. I think we're going to return to that indirect effect maybe a couple times in our conversation. So one thing as a layperson that has struck me, and I suppose millions of other people around the world, is the savagery of these conflicts. I mean, you see, it's the unspeakable practices, and they get repeated. And for example, I can't remember when the first horrid instance of rape as a instrument of war occurs, but then you see it repeated elsewhere. It becomes almost a standard tactic. And this brutality, Skip, leads me to a couple of questions. One is, it seems almost that there's an interest in genocide, not just a physical genocide, but a cultural genocide of your opponent, to wipe their memory off the face of the earth. And secondly, and correspondingly, there's obviously an absolute disdain for the Geneva Convention, International Declaration of Human Rights, any of the things that govern. Warfare is horrible enough in its own right, but at least there were these rules. What's your feeling about these?
Yes, again, an area that we were not necessarily prepared for. The internal conflicts that we're talking about were primarily directed towards resources, often natural ones that were scarce, or territory that were in many respects kept in bay in many of these countries. A good example is the former Yugoslavia. So those groups were from a benevolent dictator kept in bay. Once that was removed, the competition for resources and territory often became that. And indeed, it became quite brutal. And there was always the argument, not only in the former Yugoslavia, but in the Middle East, and certainly with Israel and Palestine, where, quite honestly, these are water wars.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
That arguments about who was really there first, historically, and what have you. But the point of the Geneva Conventions is an important one, because both the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions primarily have dealt with cross-border wars.
I see.
Okay, and we weren't really prepared, and the Geneva Conventions, in many respects, still does not apply to those internal conflicts that we are seeing. The other thing is that with the current wars, both Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were just becoming aware and maybe even finding some answers to deal with the resource aspects and the territory aspects, even providing humanitarian spaces where we could work to ensure the protections for women, children, elderly, and disabled. But with Iraq and Afghanistan, the motivations that are starting the conflict have, quite honestly, very little to do with resources and territory. It has to do with controlling a population.
That's right.
And so where, under the Geneva Conventions, under other international law, the humanitarian groups that entered to provide these protections were really covered, in many respects, respected for that. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, every civilian in those conflicts has been experiencing the same security problems.
Well, you know, I want to focus, and you bring me right to the point, and very well, to the point where I want to get us in terms of this issue of security, of civilian populations being treated indiscriminately as appropriate targets, if you will, and as a lot, and to be very specific, a lot of that violence being directed at the aid workers themselves. And it would seem to me, Skip, that must have a chilling effect on the aid community, of which, of course, you've been a part. I remember myself years ago, not that many years ago, actually, reading in the New Yorker, an article about Red Cross workers being targeted in Chechnya. It was the first I'd heard of it, but now that's getting to be common. I mean, that would seem to me to really, really be almost the ultimate insult.
Yes, and you know, the ultimate organization to work for was often the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Yeah.
And when you went out to the field, there was a Red Cross over your left chest and one on your arm. Right. And it was really in these complex emergencies. So from quite honestly, the late 1990s through, it was necessary to actually remove those protections because they became targets. Yeah. And it was very rare, quite honestly, to have international Red Cross workers become targets. Mm-hmm. But in a period of 5 years, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, actually lost 5 people. Mm-hmm. And but this also occurred with other non-governmental organizations and UN organizations. And even in the last 2 years, we've seen almost a 200% increase in attacks on the aid workers in both Afghanistan and Iraq. You know,
I want to personalize our subject right now because there's a, I won't call it, it's not an anecdote, it's a story, an actual account of you in Iraq, and I guess it's just in the wake of the war, I mean, of the invasion. And, well, you tell us a story, Skip, but I remember you standing in a group and being asked if you were responsible for health matters and not realizing yourself that moment what that question really meant.
Yeah, let me back up a little bit because, as you know, in the planning for the war with Iraq, the State Department has a precedence for those aspects dealing with recovery, rehabilitation, and humanitarian assistance. And even during the summer of 2002, so quite a way before, we were concerned with a number of different issues about the future of Iraq and the potential humanitarian problems. But you and the listeners may recall that in January there was a presidential decision directive that turned most of that over to the Department of Defense. Right. Now, in my previous briefings, which were honestly quite popular, I talked about 2 things. One was that we still had to be concerned about the fragmentation along sectarian and tribal lines. Mm-hmm. But I remember that my 4th PowerPoint slide was that looting, which was had occurred in Iraq after other conflicts, was often a potential for great political disruption. And in many ways, Saddam had the same kind of control that Tito did in Yugoslavia. You take that lid off, and we were concerned about that. Now, when the looting happened, the person who was sent up to Baghdad was me. So I ended up being the first American civilian to be sent up. And I was concerned. And when I got up there and realized how severe the looting was, I went to, rather than going to the Palestine Hotel where I was to meet with most of the hospital administrators to try to bring back the health system, which was being destroyed as we spoke, I decided to go to the International Committee of the Red Cross because I realized because of the planning had been changed, we did not have the resources to bring back the health system. Right. I'll be honest with you. And so I went to the chief of mission. But as we drove up to their headquarters and I stepped out and I was surrounded by my guards and walking to the entrance, all of a sudden an Iraqi just popped up in front of me and said, who's the Minister of Health? And I said, well, that would be me. And as fast as he appeared, he disappeared. I went in to the chief of mission and I brought up to the chief of mission that I had met one of his workers, and because I didn't know he knew that I was going to be the interim minister of health. He said, I had no idea you were, and I had to describe this individual, and he said, I have no one in my employment in that description. Make a long story short, after 3 hours of very sensitive discussions about what could and could not be done, we left, and before we got out of the street where we had met, we were hit We started to speed up. We had all been trained in terrorist driving and the responsibilities, but maybe about 200-300 yards down the road, we were hit again, this time from the front.
Was it only in retrospect you realized you'd been?
Well, we then took off from the predicted route, and quite a distance away we were hit again.
Yeah.
But in all 3 ambushes, the only vehicle that was hit was my vehicle.
Yeah.
So they knew who I was and where I was, and it was very much planned.
I'm very glad you survived it, as I'm sure you are, Skip. There are many points to be drawn from a story like that. I mean, the intense personal drama is foremost. It also strikes me, Skip, that you mentioned that dichotomy, if you will, between the State Department's wishes and the Department of Defense's practices in taking over, that these complex emergencies pose real challenges for, well, intergovernmental cooperation to begin with, but then civilian military. But I'll put it simply, perhaps there are new patterns of information sharing and you know, sort of common agreements on how you're going to go about these things that have yet to be reached.
Absolutely, and it's an uphill battle because we haven't solved that problem. And I think it was paramount, the problems that existed between the civilian and the military organizations really came to the forefront, not only in the planning, but in the execution of the aid. I think, I mean, there are multiple things that came together, reading very much like a bad novel. But it took a long time for everybody to realize that the war really wasn't over. We were just going into a different phase of it. So that the security, even though there was a honeymoon period for a while, it didn't last for very long, and the security became pervasive. But the thing that was missed, again, going back to the initial questions about the internal complex emergency, which I had brought up in every session that I had the opportunity to speak, was that the public health system was collapsing in front of us. Right. So actually by October of 2004, there were a couple of both Red Cross and Ministry of Health documents that stated that more people, the vulnerable population, were actually dying from public health problems rather than violence, even by that time.
Skip, when you mentioned the public health sector disintegrating in that way, and your earlier comment about indirect effects, and as a physician, how you chart those things over time, it led me to think the question I'm going to ask you right now, and that is this. We're talking about war, and unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the last of this, what you and I are talking about right now. But can natural disasters also lead to these complex emergencies? Obviously, for anyone in this country, you think of Katrina and what that might have been in the instance and in the aftermath.
Yes, you know, disaster taxonomy descriptions tended to, you know, we had our natural disaster experts and our technological experts and those that were involved with conflict and war. But what we've been seeing in the last decade is a common thread that's uniting all 3 of them.
Wow. And
the common thread really is in these public health emergencies. So Katrina, in my experience for my professional life, has been primarily with war and conflict. I did get involved in some post-Katrina research, and what we found in working with the remaining public health infrastructure and the authorities there in New Orleans, and we published a study that showed that a year after the hurricane was over, there was actually a 47% increase in deaths, mortality, that occurred in Katrina. The public health system was not aware of this. The fascinating thing is that it was the citizenry in New Orleans who, in the Times-Picayune paper, if you remember, that was quite popular during the disaster itself, the citizenry were observing that there were many more obituaries. And they brought it to the attention of the public health system. But the public health system, actually, they had 3 main physicians. One had died of a heart attack during the Katrina. One committed suicide, unfortunately. There was one left. But the entire surveillance system in New Orleans was paper-based, and all the paper had been flooded and destroyed. Right. So they had no baseline system, but they had no surveillance system. And so believe it or not, in a backdoor way, the obituaries became the alert, like any surveillance system would be, that something bad was happening. But the New Orleans public health infrastructure and the system had collapsed. And just one example, I mean, very few psychiatrists and psychologists remained.
Yeah.
The Charity Hospital, which is one of the largest hospitals in the United States and took care of the poverty-stricken population there, doesn't exist anymore. It totally collapsed. So, wow. You know, when this takes over and Mother Nature is in charge, quite honestly, we began to start seeing the illnesses and the deaths from public health-related aspects. And when we published the article, there was an editorial with the article that likened what had happened in Katrina to what we had seen in terms of health indices in Sierra Leone and Liberia and other complex emergencies that we had seen. So that's the common thread. Yeah. And even we've seen it despite robust funding after the tsunami. 2 years, 3 years now after the tsunami, we have major areas in those countries affected by the tsunami in which they don't have potable water, don't have sanitation. There's a health worker crisis and health facility crisis. So the same is occurring, and that's the common thread.
Very sobering. I mean, it's extremely, because you're talking about, in the same sense, these kinds of things happening in our very developed country.
Absolutely. And
occurring in other less developed places throughout the world. Begs a number of questions, Skip. One that immediately comes to mind is, particularly when you mention all those records floating away, literally, how are we, if we are, learning from event to event, gathering information, discussing findings, having the participants, many of which are non-governmental, as you mentioned before, brought into conversation so that there's some learning curve in which the response community to these critical emergencies is gaining expertise?
Among the disaster community and among many scientists, we discuss it, it's published, and that's as far as it goes, George. It just doesn't seem to get into political decision making.
Well, that's terrible, isn't it? I mean,
really
in a blunt.
But remember, and a good example of that is that all that data about the levees had been written for the couple of decades before this tragedy happened. True. And it just didn't translate into, okay, we better do something about it. And the concern that we have is that we have not kept up with the public health protective infrastructure. A lot of it is outdated. As a matter of fact, water aquifers in this part of the country, in Washington, D.C., were constructed in the 1800s and they haven't been replaced. But this goes for electrical grids, if you remember that tragedy in New England, and that was quite archaic. So with a population growth the way it's been, quite honestly, the public health infrastructure isn't there. On a day-to-day basis, we don't see much slippage. But when there is a natural disaster and the public health infrastructure is asked to increase the capacity, it just isn't there. And you know, the quote that I've used over the years is that disasters, quite honestly, keep governments honest, but the disasters also define the public health and immediately expose the vulnerabilities. So as soon as the disaster happens and we start seeing these indirect consequences, we can say, oh, you know, yes, that's a public health infrastructure problem or a system problem.
That's extremely helpful, Skip, and once again, extremely sobering, but quite helpful. You, because you continue actively, obviously, in the field, and as a doctor and as a researcher, have been a part of a team, Skip, if I understand it correctly, who's developed a triage protocol that would help allocate resources in the event of something that was much talked about a brief while ago, but hasn't gone away as a fear, and that's the avian flu pandemic, which is very forward-looking. How good are we, and I take that as a hopeful sign of people saying this is what we'll do if we have to. How good are we at anticipating these things?
Well, our problem is this, is that we tend to put all the disasters together. And this goes right to the citizen level. We are very, very hospital-centric and dependent. So in a mass casualty situation and all those issues, we depend on the hospital. That's where people go.
Yeah.
If we have a pandemic, quite honestly, we don't want people to go to the hospitals. And what we found in SARS, which quite honestly I say was the best thing since sliced bread, because it wasn't that transmissible, it wasn't that severe, but it was a good lesson. And what happened if we look at Toronto, which is certainly, you know, within North America, and we should pay attention to it. But for the first 10 to 14 days, the majority of people who were showing up at the hospital were individuals not yet exposed, so they were susceptible, but they were fearful that they were. And so they showed up at the hospital. Guess what happened at the hospital? They were then mixed in with people who had the infection. And so that continued the transmission of it.
Right.
So the goal of pandemics and other health-related kinds of disasters is to stop the transmission of the disease.
Yeah.
So we need to have hotlines, which quite honestly is the first line of triage now in Canada. We need to have many volunteers, and we need to have other than hospital-centric health facilities where people, whether they're just susceptible, exposed, or infectious, and go to. And that we don't have. We're not prepared for that at this point.
Well, Skip, I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation, telling us not only what we have faced, but as you concluded on that note, the things we're not prepared yet to do, and we have to get busy on.
George, thank you, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Appreciate it very much.
Well, I want to thank you, Skip, for all that you do on behalf of this entire country, and if I dare say so, the world, sir. Thank you. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcnetworks.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. And Skip Burkle, thank you. You're a really good guest.
Oh, thank you.
I say, well done.
The Art of Conversation, Dialogue at the Woodrow Wilson Center features 20 years of dialogue, distributed by the Johns Hopkins University Press, www.press.jhu.edu.